Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his solitary cabin, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana Territory stretching before him like a painter's empty canvas. The air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the scent of pine and damp earth, but today it also carried a fragile thread of anticipation, a feeling so foreign to Elias it felt like a trespasser in the well-ordered loneliness of his heart. He'd spent years carving a life from this rugged land, his hands calloused, his spirit weathered, his silence a shield against a world that had long ago taught him the bitter taste of loss. He was waiting. Waiting for the stagecoach, for a woman named Agnes, a name he'd only seen on paper, a prospective bride whose passage he'd paid in a desperate, almost reckless bid to staunch the slow bleed of his solitude. He'd pictured her, a woman of quiet strength, someone to share the burden of the endless days, perhaps even to bring a touch of warmth to the cold stone hearth that mirrored his own insides. What he didn't expect, what no letter or lonely prayer could have prepared him for, was the sight that slowly materialized from the morning mist clinging to the valley floor. It wasn't the sturdy figure of a woman ready to face the frontier. It was a ragged procession of small, shivering forms, like spectral deer emerging from the woods, their movements hesitant, their eyes wide with a primal fear that resonated with a forgotten chamber in Elias's own soul. 7 of them. 7 children, led by a girl barely on the cusp of womanhood, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, yet set with a fierce, protective determination that belied her tender years. What happened next would not only shatter Elias Thorne's carefully constructed isolation, but would send ripples through the stubborn heart of a frontier community, forcing a man who believed he had nothing left to give to confront the unexpected, overwhelming call of humanity. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. It's a privilege to share these stories with you, and I'm always curious to know who's listening. As this tale begins to unfold, I invite you to introduce yourself in the comments and let me know where you're tuning in from. Your presence here makes this storytelling journey all the more meaningful. The eldest girl, who couldn't have been more than 13, carried a bundled infant, so still Elias initially feared the worst. Another child, a boy with eyes too old for his face, clung to her tattered skirt. Behind them, a smaller girl with surprisingly bright hair despite the grime tried to comfort 2 even younger, identical little girls who looked like startled fawns. Bringing up the rear, stumbling with weariness, was a small boy whose whimpers were lost in the vast silence of the prairie. They stopped a dozen yards from his porch, a tableau of human wreckage against the indifferent majesty of the landscape. The bride, Agnes, was nowhere in sight. Only this impossible delegation. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a feeling that was part disappointment, part sheer, unadulterated shock. His carefully laid plans, the meager hope he'd allowed to flicker, was snuffed out, replaced by this incomprehensible reality. He was a man of few words, his emotions barricaded behind years of solitary labor and unspoken grief. His wife, Martha, and their infant son had been taken by the fever a decade past, leaving a wound that had never truly healed, only scarred over into a dull ache of resignation. The idea of a new wife had been a fragile attempt to build something over the ruins, not to replace what was lost, but to simply not be so utterly alone. The eldest girl, Lily, as he would later learn her name was, took a hesitant step forward. Her voice, when it came, was raspy, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the morning air with the sharpness of splintered glass. "Mister, please, we got nowhere else." Elias looked from her desperate face to the tiny, pinched faces of the children huddled behind her. Their clothes were rags, their feet bare or wrapped in what looked like sackcloth, blue with cold. Hunger gnawed at their features, carving hollows beneath their eyes. He saw not just children, but the brutal signature of abandonment, a careless scrawl across their innocent lives. His initial thought, a shameful, fleeting thing, was to turn away, to tell them this wasn't his concern, that he was waiting for someone else, someone who was supposed to help him. not add to his burdens. But the infant in Lily's arms let out a thin, weak cry, a sound so fragile it seemed to pierce the hardened shell around Elias's heart. He had expected a partner, a helper. He had not expected a catastrophe. He was a rancher, not a nursemaid, not a savior. His life was about survival, his own survival, measured in cords of woodcut, fences mended, and the lonely passage of seasons. These children were a storm he hadn't seen coming, threatening to capsize the rickety boat of his existence. Yet as he looked at Lily's unflinching gaze, a gaze that held not just fear but a profound, weary responsibility, he saw a flicker of something familiar, the grim determination of one who fights for survival against overwhelming odds. It was a look he often saw in his own shaving mirror. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the sound harsh in the quiet. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, his voice gruff, unused to such gentle inquiries. Lily gestured vaguely back the way they'd come. "Wagon broke. Ma said to keep walking towards the sun, look for smoke. Said someone would help." Her voice cracked on the word Ma, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The unspoken hung heavy in the air. Their mother was gone, one way or another. Whether by illness, accident, or deliberate desertion, the result was the same. 7 orphans on his doorstep. Elias swallowed. The silence of the ranch, usually a comfort, now seemed to press in on him, amplifying the children's ragged breaths, the baby's fretful murmur. He thought of the extra room, small and sparse, prepared with a hesitant hope for Agnes. He thought of the meager supplies he had, stretched thin even for one, let alone 8 additional mouths. But then he looked at the smallest of the twin girls, her thumb jammed in her mouth, her eyes fixed on him with an unnerving, unblinking terror. He saw the shadow of his own lost child in her innocent fear. "Well," he said, the word feeling inadequate, clumsy. "You can't stay out here. Come on in. There's stew from last night." It wasn't an invitation born of warmth, not yet. It was a capitulation to a force greater than his desire for solitude, a reluctant acknowledgement of a basic human decency he couldn't quite extinguish, no matter how hard life had tried. The children didn't move, their fear a palpable thing. Lily, however, nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly with relief. She whispered something to the boy beside her, Tom, who then relayed it down the line. One by one, like a flock of weary birds, they followed Elias into the dim, sparse interior of the cabin, their small, dirt-stained feet hesitant on the rough-hewn wooden floorboards. The scent of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness that usually defined Elias's home was suddenly, irrevocably, altered by the faint, unsettling aroma of unwashed bodies, fear, and a desperate, clinging hope. The days that followed were a chaotic blur. Elias Thorne, a man whose routines were as fixed as the North Star, found his world turned upside down. His small cabin, once a haven of orderly solitude, was now filled with the constant, unsettling presence of children. There was Lily, quiet and watchful, her young face etched with a maturity that wrenched at something deep inside him. She moved with a weary competence, trying to manage the younger ones, herding them, hushing them, her eyes constantly darting to Elias, gauging his reactions, always braced for rejection. Tom, the 10-year-old, was her silent lieutenant, rarely speaking but always observing, his gaze unnervingly perceptive. Sarah, at 8, possessed a surprising resilience, a flicker of a smile sometimes breaking through the fear, especially when Elias gruffly offered her an extra spoonful of watery porridge. 6-year-old Ben was a bundle of anxieties, prone to sudden tears and clinging to Lily's legs whenever Elias came too near. And then there were the 4-year-old twins, May and June, almost indistinguishable with their matted blonde hair and wide, bewildered eyes. They moved as a unit, a small, scared echo of each other, their whispered conversations, a private language in the unsettling newness of their surroundings. The baby, Daniel, was perhaps the easiest and the hardest. His needs were simple: food, warmth, a clean, or cleaner, scrap of cloth. But his utter helplessness was a constant, silent accusation against the cruelty of the world that had cast him adrift. Elias found himself in a state of perpetual, low-grade overwhelm. He knew cattle, knew the land, knew the biting solitude of winter. He knew nothing about children. He tried to continue his ranch work, mending fences, tending to his small herd, but his mind was always back at the cabin, a knot of worry in his gut. Were they safe? Had one of them wandered off? Was the baby crying? He'd leave a meager meal simmering on the stove, usually a thin stew of beans and dried meat, or a pot of porridge, and instruct Lily, with awkward formality, on how to dole it out. He slept poorly, the unfamiliar sounds of small coughs, whimpers, and restless movements seeping through the thin walls of his own small sleeping space, which he'd partitioned off with a blanket after moving the children into his slightly larger main room. Trust was a slow, reluctant bloom, like a desert flower after a rare rain. It wasn't built on grand gestures, for Elias had none to offer. It was built in the small, consistent acts of survival. The daily provision of food, however scant, the warmth of the fire he kept stoked against the encroaching autumn chill. The fact that he hadn't, as Lily clearly feared in those first few days, sent them away. He noticed Lily would save the smallest portion for herself, ensuring the others ate first. He started, without comment, to leave a slightly larger piece of bread or meat near her plate. She never acknowledged it, but he saw the flicker in her eyes, a silent thank you that spoke volumes. One evening, he returned from a long day tracking a stray calf to find Lily attempting to stitch a tear in one of his old work shirts with a rusty needle and a piece of frayed thread she must have salvaged from somewhere. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her small hands clumsy but determined. He stood in the doorway, watching her, a strange ache in his chest. It was the kind of small, domestic act Martha might have done, a gesture of care in a life that had been devoid of such things for so long. He cleared his throat, and she jumped, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Leave it," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's an old shirt." She dropped it as if burned, her face falling. "Sorry, Mr. Thorne, I just thought to fix it." He felt a pang of something akin to guilt. He hadn't meant to sound harsh. "It's fine," he mumbled, turning away to hang up his hat. Later that night, by the dim light of a tallow candle, he found a newer needle and a spool of decent thread in Martha's old sewing box, a box he hadn't opened in a decade. He left them on the table without a word. The next morning, the shirt was mended, the stitches small and uneven, but undeniably careful. A small, unspoken understanding passed between them. The shadows of their past, however, were long and persistent. Nightmares often plagued the younger children. Ben would wake screaming, and Lily would be there instantly, murmuring comfort, her own exhaustion a heavy cloak around her. Elias learned to sleep through it, or rather, to acknowledge it as part of the new, uneasy rhythm of his life. He still didn't know the full story of their abandonment. Lily offered little, her words guarded, her memories clearly painful. He pieced together fragments, a father long gone, a mother who grew increasingly desperate, vague mentions of a long journey west that ended in disaster. The scars they carried weren't just the dirt and hunger, they were etched deep in their souls, in their too old eyes, and their flinching responses to any sudden movement or raised voice. Elias, too, wrestled with his own ghosts. The ghost of Martha, the ghost of the son he never knew, the ghost of the quiet, predictable life he had lost, first to grief and now to this unexpected, overwhelming responsibility. He was a man adrift, his compass shattered, unsure if this new, chaotic current would lead him to ruin or to an entirely unforeseen shore. The fragile equilibrium Elias had managed to establish with the children was always precarious, as vulnerable as a new seedling in a harsh frost. He knew, with a certainty that settled like cold dread in his bones, that their presence on his remote ranch could not remain a secret forever. The nearest town, Redemption, was a good day's ride away, a rough-and-tumble settlement populated by weary prospectors, stern-faced farmers, and a few self-righteous souls who considered themselves the arbiters of frontier morality. Elias had always kept his distance, his visits infrequent and strictly for supplies, his interactions minimal. He preferred the company of his cattle to that of most men, but now the thought of redemption and the judgment it might pass on his unusual household loomed large. The catalyst for the crisis he'd been dreading arrived not on horseback, but in the form of a hacking cough. Little Sarah, usually the most resilient, woke one morning with a fevered brow and a cough that rattled her small frame. Elias, whose medical knowledge was limited to treating minor injuries on livestock, felt a surge of helpless panic. He'd seen fever take Martha and his boy. The fear it instilled was primal. Lily, too, was beside herself, her young face pale with worry as she bathed Sarah's forehead with cool water, her touch gentle, but her eyes filled with a desperate anxiety. "She's burning up, Mr. Thorne," Lily whispered, her voice tight. Just like Mama got before." She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the small, tense cabin. Elias knew he couldn't handle this alone. Sarah needed more than willow bark tea and wishful thinking. She needed a doctor, or at least someone with more experience in treating childhood illnesses. And the only place to find such a person was redemption. The thought of riding into town, of having to explain the 7 children under his care, filled him with a profound unease. He could already hear the whispers, imagine the suspicious glances. A loner like him, suddenly responsible for a brood of abandoned youngsters. Questions would be asked, uncomfortable questions. Authorities, such as they were on the frontier, might get involved. The children could be split up, sent to an orphanage miles away, their fragile, newly formed bond with each other, and perhaps even with him, shattered. He looked at Sarah, her small face flushed, her breathing shallow. He looked at Lily, her eyes pleading with him, a silent appeal for help that transcended her usual guardedness. The choice was stark. Risk exposure and judgment in redemption, or risk losing Sarah to the fever that had already stolen so much from him. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Lily," he said, his voice firm, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "Keep her cool. I'm riding to redemption. I'll fetch Doc Miller." Lily's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and relief warring within them. "But the town, I'll handle the town," Elias said, though he had no idea how. "You just look after Sarah, and the others, keep them inside, out of sight if anyone comes snooping." He saddled his sturdiest horse, his movements economical and efficient, but his mind raced. Doc Miller was a decent man, if a bit fond of his whiskey, but he was also a talker. News would spread like wildfire. He thought of Mrs. Henderson, the self-appointed guardian of redemption's morals, whose sharp tongue and sharper gaze missed nothing. He thought of Sheriff Brody, a man who generally preferred to let things be but would have to act if a formal complaint was made, or if the children were deemed neglected or endangered. As he rode, the vast landscape seemed to mock his anxieties. The mountains stood impassive, the sky an indifferent blue. He was just one man, facing a problem far bigger than himself. For years he had prided himself on his self-sufficiency, his independence. He needed no one. But now, for the sake of a sick child he barely knew, for the sake of 6 other frightened faces who had inexplicably become his charges, he was riding towards the very community he had shunned, but ready to lay bare his unusual circumstances and face whatever judgment came his way. It was a test, he realized, not just of his willingness to help, but of the depth of the change these children had wrought in him. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the grieving widower, the lonely rancher. He was, in some strange, terrifying, and unexpectedly profound way, responsible. And that responsibility, he was beginning to understand, was a heavier, yet somehow more meaningful burden than loneliness had ever been. The ride to redemption was fraught with a tension that mirrored the turmoil in Elias's soul. Every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers of impending judgment. Every shadow seemed to conceal a prying eye. When he finally reached the dusty main street, it felt as though every window held a curious face, every doorway a silent observer. He tied his horse outside Doc Miller's clapboard office, the scent of antiseptic and stale tobacco wafting out to meet him. Doc Miller, a portly man with kind eyes bloodshot from too little sleep or too much liquor, listened to Elias's terse explanation with a practiced neutrality, though his eyebrows rose a fraction when Elias mentioned 7 children. 7, you say? Doc Miller whistled softly. Quite the handful for a man like you, Thorne. Where'd they spring from? Elias kept his explanation brief, sticking to the essentials: a broken-down wagon, an absent mother, a sick child. He didn't elaborate on his own shattered plans for a bride, nor did he dwell on the emotional upheaval the children's arrival had caused. He just needed the doctor's help. Fever, you say? Coughing bad? Doc Miller was already gathering his worn leather bag. All right, Thorne, let's go see this little one, but you know folks are gonna talk. 7 stray lambs turning up on the Thorne ranch. That's juicier than Mrs. Henderson's apple pie. Elias merely grunted in response. He knew, and the knowing was a cold weight in his stomach. As Doc Miller tended to Sarah, his movements surprisingly gentle for such a large man, Elias found himself pacing the small cabin. The other children were huddled in a corner, watching with wide, scared eyes. Lily stood near the makeshift bed, her gaze fixed on Sarah, her small hands clenched. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness, so fierce it startled him. These weren't just strays, they were his. In some fundamental way, they belonged with him now. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Doc Miller eventually straightened up, a tired sigh escaping him. It's lung fever, right enough. Nasty, but I've seen worse. Caught it early, that's good. She needs rest, fluids, and this medicine 3 times a day. He handed Lily a small bottle of dark liquid. And keep her warm. She's a fighter, this one. He glanced around the cabin, his gaze taking in the other children, the sparse furnishings, the evidence of a man struggling to cope. You got your hands full, Thorne, more than full. News, as Doc Miller predicted, spread through Redemption with the speed of a prairie fire. By the time Elias rode back into town a few days later for more supplies and medicine, the whispers had become open stares, the curious glances more pointed. Mrs. Henderson, a formidable woman whose bonnet seemed to bristle with indignation, accosted him outside the general store. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice sharp enough to curdle milk, "the whole town is abuzz. 7 children, and no mother in sight. It's hardly a proper situation, is it? What are your intentions? Surely they belong in an institution where they can be properly cared for." Elias, usually a man to avoid confrontation, felt a cold anger rise within him. He looked at Mrs. Prossons. Henderson, at the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and censure. He thought of Sarah, slowly recovering under Lily's devoted care. He thought of Tom's quiet strength, of Ben's gradually lessening fear, of the twins who had actually offered him a shy smile that morning. He thought of baby Daniel, whose tiny hand had curled around his calloused finger just the day before, a small, trusting gesture that had inexplicably tightened his chest. "My intentions, madam," Elias said, his voice low but steady, carrying a conviction that surprised even himself, "are to see that those children are safe, fed, and cared for. They've lost enough. They won't be sent to any institution. They're staying with me." A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson looked aghast. "With you? A bachelor? A recluse? It's scandalous. Sheriff Brody will have to be informed. This is a matter for the authorities." "Sheriff Brody knows where to find me," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. He turned and walked into the general store, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He had drawn his line in the sand. He was no longer just a man waiting for a life to begin. He was a man defending the unexpected life that had found him. The confrontation had solidified something within him, a fierce, protective resolve. These children, who had arrived as a burden, had become his purpose. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this story unfolds, and how Elias and these 7 children navigate the challenges that still lie ahead. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. The confrontation with Mrs. Henderson was merely the opening salvo in a battle Elias hadn't anticipated fighting. Redemption, it seemed, was not content to let the matter rest. Whispers followed him like shadows, and disapproving glares were as common as tumbleweeds. Sheriff Brody, a weary man who looked older than his years, did indeed pay Elias a visit a few days later. He was polite, even sympathetic, but firm. "Elias," the sheriff began, accepting a cup of watered-down coffee, his eyes taking in the surprisingly orderly, if still sparse, cabin. Lily had insisted on tidying up before he arrived, her small face serious with the effort. "Folks are concerned. 7 children, alone with a man. Well, you know how people talk. There are procedures for abandoned children, orphanages, foster homes." Elias met his gaze steadily. "They're not abandoned anymore, Sheriff. They're with me. They're safe here. They're family." The word felt strange on his tongue, yet profoundly right. Lily, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, stepped forward. "We want to stay with Mr. Thorne, Sheriff. He's good to us. Please don't take us away." Her voice was small but laced with a desperate sincerity. Tom, Ben, and even Sarah, still pale but recovering, nodded in fervent agreement from their spot by the hearth. The twins, May and June, peeked out from behind Lily's skirt, their eyes wide. Sheriff Brody looked from the children's earnest faces to Elias's determined one. He sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "I ain't got no official complaint, Elias, not yet. And I can see they're fed and got a roof. But if someone files one, my hands might be tied. There's talk of them being a burden, of you not being equipped." "I'm equipped enough," Elias stated, his jaw set. "They're not a burden. They're children. They need a home. They've found one here." The sheriff stayed a while longer, asking gentle questions of Lily about their journey, his gaze softening as he listened. He observed the way Elias interacted with the children, the gruff but unmistakable kindness, the way he ensured the baby, Daniel, was warm, the almost imperceptible softening of his hard features when one of the smaller children spoke to him. Before he left, Sheriff Brody clapped Elias on the shoulder. "You're a better man than many give you credit for, Thorne, but be careful. Redemption can be a harsh judge." The external pressure, however, served only to solidify the bond between Elias and the children, and among the children themselves. They were a small, besieged unit, finding strength in their shared adversity. Lily became Elias's shadow, anticipating his needs, helping with chores around the cabin with a diligence that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Tom, quiet Tom, began to show an interest in the ranch work, following Elias to the barn, watching him mend tack or feed the livestock, his eyes absorbing every detail. Sarah, recovering her strength, brought a tentative cheerfulness to the cabin, her laughter, when it came, like a fragile melody. Even Ben started to venture further from Lily's side, sometimes offering Elias a shy, gap-toothed grin. The twins, May and June, began to treat him as a familiar landmark, occasionally even tugging on his trousers to show him a pretty stone or a feather they'd found. And baby Daniel, who had no memory of any other life, would often reach for Elias, his small hands grasping for the comforting solidity of the man who had, against all odds, become his protector. Elias found himself changing in ways he hadn't thought possible. The silence he had once cherished now felt empty if it wasn't punctuated by the sounds of children, a distant shout, a hushed giggle, even a frustrated cry. He began to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small explanations to Tom about the workings of the ranch, in gentle reassurances to Ben, in quiet words of praise for Lily. He even found himself humming old, half-forgotten tunes as he worked, something he hadn't done since Martha was alive. The deep well of grief within him hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like a bottomless abyss. It was as if these children, with their own profound losses, had somehow reached into that darkness and pulled him towards a faint, flickering light. One evening, as a biting wind howled outside, foreshadowing the coming winter, they were all gathered around the hearth. Elias was mending a harness, the children nearby, Lily telling a hushed story to the younger ones. A comfortable, almost domestic silence filled the small cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Lily's soft voice. Elias looked at the small, firelit faces, their earlier fear now softened into a fragile contentment. He thought of Agnes, the bride he had been waiting for, a woman whose face he couldn't even imagine anymore. She seemed like a phantom from another life, a life that no longer held any appeal. His gaze fell on Lily, her brow furrowed in concentration as she recounted a tale of brave knights and kind fairies, a world away from the harsh realities they had known. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering love for her siblings. Suddenly, a wave of profound emotion washed over Elias, so potent it almost buckled him. It wasn't just responsibility he felt for these children, or even affection. It was something deeper, something fiercely protective, something akin to love, a love he hadn't thought himself capable of feeling again. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "Lily," he said, his voice husky. She looked up, her story halting. "Yes, Mr. Thorne." He paused, searching for the right words, words that had always eluded him. You children, this is your home now, for as long as you want it. No one's going to take you away. I won't let them." Lily's eyes, usually so guarded, filled with a sudden, luminous sheen. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated relief and joy that it struck Elias to the core. Tom's head came up, his gaze locking with Elias's, a silent understanding passing between them. Sarah beamed. Even Ben looked less anxious. The unspoken fear that had haunted them, the fear of being uprooted again, had finally been laid to rest. In that moment, by the warmth of a humble fire, in a remote cabin on the vast Montana prairie, a new family was truly forged, not of blood, but of shared hardship, unexpected kindness, and a love that had blossomed in the most barren of soils. The storm of societal judgment might still rage outside, but within the walls of the cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. The decision to formally claim the children as his own, to make their belonging permanent and unassailable, was not one Elias made lightly, but it felt as inevitable as the changing seasons. The whispers in redemption hadn't ceased, and Mrs. Henderson still eyed him with pious disapproval whenever their paths crossed. But something had shifted, both within Elias and in the way some of the townsfolk perceived him. His steadfast dedication to the children, the visible improvement in their health and spirits, and Lily's quiet dignity when she accompanied him for supplies, had begun to chip away at the initial wall of prejudice. A few people, like the blacksmith who gave Tom a small, discarded horseshoe for luck, or the baker's wife who slipped Lily an extra loaf of bread, offered small, unspoken gestures of support. Elias knew that informal guardianship wouldn't be enough to silence the doubters or protect the children indefinitely. He needed to make it legal. The thought of navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of frontier law was daunting, but the image of Lily's radiant smile when he'd promised them a home spurred him on. He sought out Judge Harriman, an aging, pragmatic man known more for his common sense than his adherence to the strict letter of the law. The meeting took place in the judge's dusty office, books piled high, the air thick with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. Elias, with Lily by his side, for she insisted on being there, her small hand clutching his, laid out his case. He spoke not with eloquence, but with a raw, heartfelt honesty that was far more persuasive. He described finding the children, their desperate state, and the bond that had formed between them. He spoke of his ranch, his ability to provide, and his unwavering commitment to their well-being. Lily, when invited to speak, did so with a quiet composure that impressed the judge. "Mr. Thorne saved us, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. He gave us food when we were starving, shelter when we were cold. He's like a father to us now. We don't want to go anywhere else. This is our home." Judge Harriman listened patiently, his gaze shrewd but not unkind. He asked pointed questions about Elias's means, about the children's schooling. Elias admitted awkwardly that Lily was teaching the younger ones what she knew, and he was trying his best with sums, and about his plans for their future. He was testing Elias, gauging the depth of his resolve. Finally, the judge leaned back in his chair, a slow smile creasing his weathered face. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "it seems to me that these children have found a better home with you than any institution could provide. Providence works in mysterious ways, does it not? You were expecting a bride, and you received a ready-made family instead. Perhaps it was the better bargain." He chuckled softly. "I see no reason why these children shouldn't remain in your care. We'll draw up the papers. Guardianship for now. Adoption, perhaps, down the line, if that's what you all wish." Relief washed over Elias so powerfully that he felt his knees weaken. Lily squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The primary threat, the fear of official intervention and separation, had been neutralized. They were safe. With the legalities settled, a new sense of purpose infused Elias. The ranch, once just a place of solitary labor, became a home in the truest sense. He started making improvements, not just for functionality, but for comfort. He partitioned off a section of the barn loft, creating a surprisingly cozy sleeping space for Tom and Ben, filled with clean straw and old blankets. He built sturdy bunk beds for the girls in the main cabin, and even fashioned a small, smooth rocking cradle for Daniel. Lily, with a resourcefulness that constantly amazed him, planted a small vegetable garden near the cabin, her efforts yielding a welcome addition to their meager diet. The children, feeling secure for the first time in their young lives, began to truly blossom. Their laughter became a common sound, echoing across the yard. They helped with chores, not out of fear, but with a sense of belonging and contribution. Tom became Elias's right-hand man, learning to mend fences, feed the chickens, and even, under Elias's careful tutelage, ride one of the gentler horses. Sarah, May, and June filled the cabin with their imaginative games, their earlier anxieties fading like morning mist. The community's perception, too, began a slow but discernible shift. Mrs. Henderson still sniffed disapprovingly, but her voice lost some of its stridency. Others, witnessing the transformation in both Elias and the children, began to offer quiet nods of respect, sometimes even a friendly greeting. Doc Miller would stop by occasionally, not just for medical reasons, but for a cup of coffee and a chat, often leaving behind a piece of candy for the children or a worn book for Lily. The Thorne Ranch, once a symbol of isolation and grief, was becoming a testament to the unexpected power of compassion and the resilience of the human heart. Elias Thorne, the loner, was no longer alone. He had found his family, not in the woman he had sent for, but in the 7 abandoned souls who had stumbled into his life and, in doing so, had led him out of his own desolate wilderness. Years passed, like the seasons turning over the vast Montana landscape. The raw edges of the Thorne Ranch softened, much like Elias himself. The cabin, once stark and bare, now bore the unmistakable signs of a lived-in, loved home. Brightly colored, if crudely stitched, curtains hung at the windows, a joint effort by Lily and Sarah. Shelves that once held only dust and solitude now displayed an assortment of childish treasures, unusually shaped rocks, birds' nests, Tom's carved wooden animals. The small vegetable garden Lily had started had expanded, its bounty supplementing their table and even providing a little extra to trade in redemption for necessities like flour and sugar. The children were growing, shedding their early fragility like outgrown clothes. Lily, now a young woman of 19, had become the quiet, capable heart of their household. Her intelligence and grace were undeniable, and she managed the domestic sphere with a competence that belied her youth, her love for her siblings, a fierce, unwavering flame. She had also taken it upon herself to ensure the younger ones received an education, her own hunger for knowledge inspiring them. Tom, at 16, was tall and strong, his father's quiet nature mirrored in his steady gaze, but with a kindness that was all his own. He was Elias's shadow on the ranch, learning every aspect of the work, his capable hands already skilled. Sarah, a vibrant 15-year-old, possessed a cheerful disposition and a surprising talent for healing, often assisting Lily with minor scrapes and illnesses, her touch gentle and reassuring. Ben, at 13, had overcome much of his early timidity, developing a dry wit and a knack for storytelling that often had the family laughing around the fire. The twins, May and June, were 11, still inseparable, but each developing her own distinct personality, May more adventurous, June more reflective. And Daniel, the baby Elias had once feared was too fragile to survive, was now a boisterous 7-year-old, his energy boundless, his laughter echoing through the once silent cabin, a constant reminder of the life that had returned to this place. Elias Thorne, his hair now more silver than brown, his face deeply lined by sun and time, moved with the slower gait of a man who had lived a full, hard life. But his eyes, once haunted by loss and loneliness, now held a deep, quiet contentment. He had never formally adopted the children. The guardianship Judge Harriman had granted years ago had simply evolved into an unspoken, unbreakable familial bond. They were his children, and he was their father in every way that mattered. The scars of their pasts, his own grief, their abandonment, were still there, like faint tracings on old parchment. But they were no longer gaping wounds. They were part of their story, a testament to their resilience, to the healing power of love found in the most unexpected of circumstances. The ranch itself had become a small haven, not just for them, but occasionally for others. A drifter given a hot meal and a night's rest in the barn, a neighboring family helped through a harsh winter. The compassion they had received, they now extended to others, a quiet legacy of their own journey. Redemption, too, had largely made its peace with the unconventional Thorne family. Mrs. Henderson had long since passed on, and a new generation, many of whom had grown up hearing the story of the loner rancher and the 7 children, viewed them with a mixture of respect and affection. The Thorne Ranch was no longer a place of suspicion, but a symbol of fortitude and unconventional love. One crisp autumn evening, much like the one when the children had first arrived, Elias sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Lily sat beside him, mending a shirt, the familiar, comforting rhythm of her needle, a counterpoint to the chirping crickets. The younger children's laughter drifted from the yard where Tom was showing Daniel how to skip stones. A profound sense of peace settled over Elias, a peace he had once believed impossible. He thought of Agnes, the bride he had waited for, a ghost from a distant past. He felt no regret, only a quiet gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had sought a companion to ease his loneliness, and instead he had been given a family that had filled his life with purpose, with noise, with challenges, and with an abundance of love he hadn't known his heart could hold. Lily looked up from her sewing, her gaze meeting his, a gentle, unspoken understanding passing between them, a language forged in shared hardship and enduring affection. "It's a beautiful evening, Pa," she said softly, using the name that had come naturally to her years ago, a name that still warmed Elias to his core. Elias nodded, his gaze sweeping over the land that was now teeming with life, his life, their life. "Aye, Lily girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It surely is." The silence that followed was not empty, but full of shared memories, unspoken love, and the quiet contentment of a hard-won, deeply cherished peace. The scars remained, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were simply the map of their journey, a story of how 7 abandoned children and a lonely rancher had found their way home together. If you're a returning viewer, we'd love to hear from you. Just type "yes" in the comments below so we know our community is growing. Your support truly means the world to us and allows us to continue bringing these narratives to you. Thank you for being part of our story.